Welcome to the Cold War. In this episode, we're going to be looking at some of the major causes of the Cold War, as well as some of the major events that shaped the Cold War. We're going to be looking at how this relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, now you know as Russia, could have led to this period of tension between the two in what we refer to as the Cold War. And if there was no physical conflict, why do we call it a war? So you may remember that the Soviet Union was the world's first communist country. The Soviet system was based on the 19th century ideals of Karl Marx. Communists believed that the non-communist societies, landowners and businessmen, known as capitalists, used their wealth and power to exploit workers. They keep most of the wealth that workers create for themselves. The conflict of interest between capitalists and workers led to class struggle. The conditions of workers in capitalist societies grow increasingly worse until workers are finally driven to overthrow the ruling class of landowners and businessmen in a violent revolution. The Soviet communists claim this happened with the Russian Revolution in 1917. In this ideal communist society, private property will be eliminated, government will go away, and everyone will work happily for the good of society as a whole. In this workers' paradise, each member of society will contribute accordingly to his or her abilities and receive from society according to his or her needs. In the United States, we have a far different social, political, and economic system. In the United States, we elect leaders democratically, we have freedom of speech, we have freedom of the press, we're also free to own property and make whatever they could afford to produce and sell. This system is the exact opposite of the Soviet system under Stalin. Americans hoped at the time war-torn countries of Europe would adopt their system. Stalin, however, in the USSR, was determined to spread Soviet-style communism. So I want to make sure that we also know who these leaders that we're going to be talking about of the early Cold War years are. I have their pictures here, and I wonder if you know who they are. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to just take a second and think about who these leaders are and what country they belong to. So go ahead and begin. Okay, so let's see how we did. And let's start with the picture at the top left. If you said that this was Joseph Stalin, and he was the communist leader of the Soviet Union, the USSR, then you would be correct. In this middle picture here, if you said this was the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, you would also be correct. And if you said this picture here was our own President, Harry S. Truman, you would also be correct. And at the bottom here, if you said this bottom left was Communist Chinese leader Mao Zedong, a couple of ways to spell that, you would also be correct. The last one here might be a little difficult, but if you said that this was the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung, you would also be correct. So good job, everyone. So we can't go very much further into the Cold War without addressing the two conferences that happened at the end of the war, the first being in Yalta. You can see there the meeting of the Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. This happened in February of 1945. And the major thing that was decided on there was that Germany would be divided into 4 sections of control. You can see there. Berlin would be divided between East and West Berlin, as well as Germany, the East and West Germany. And the Soviets would have the control of the eastern sections. The U.S., Britain, and France would have their own sections of control. You can see there also the 3 leaders, and FDR in the middle. He looks not at all well. He would die a month later, and he knew he was very sick, but wanted to make this meeting. It also importantly decided that the USSR would enter the war against Japan and help the United States end this war. So the second of the conferences would be the Potsdam Conference, and this would happen in August of 1945. And here you can see our U.S. President, Harry S. Truman, in the middle, flanked by Stalin and Churchill. So President Roosevelt dies in April of 1945, and just weeks before Germany surrendered, Truman, in August, meets with Stalin and Churchill at Potsdam in Germany in order to decide on the treatment of Germany, the final campaign against Japan, and the future of Europe after World War II would be over, because the end was soon in sight. It was during this conference Truman made the difficult decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. Serious differences between the U.S. and the United States arose at Potsdam, and this is really why we see the Cold War era begin. So, meanwhile, with the failure of the Soviets to hold free elections in Poland at the end of the war, and of the United States to share its atomic secrets, the Cold War began quite quickly. Local communists come to power throughout Eastern Europe, trade and communications between Eastern and Western Europe were cut off, and the British Prime Minister, in a speech in early 1946, said that an iron curtain had fallen, closing off Eastern Europe from the West. For the next 40 years or more, travel and contact between the U.S. and the East and the West was restricted, and Eastern Europe governments became what we call satellite nations of the Soviet Union. So after World War II, it becomes very clear that the United States is going to be dedicated to preventing the spread of communism. The first example of this comes in 1947. We have here President Truman. He is signing the Truman Doctrine, which proposed substantial financial aid to, in particular, Turkey and Greece, because at the time they were particularly vulnerable to communist governments rising. And the second example, in 1948, we have the Marshall Plan. Okay, we take this even one step further. And here you can see General Marshall, who proposed this plan. And if you bring up the map here, you can see there were $12 billion in economic aid given to countries like France, Italy, Germany, Norway, Greece, Turkey, all in the name of preventing the spread of communism. $12 billion at a time when we probably didn't have $12 billion. So one of the things that early on complicated the relationship between the USSR and the United States was what becomes known as the Berlin Blockade in 1948. So Berlin, the old capital of Germany, was located deep in the Russian occupation zone, which you see here. Okay, and the city had been divided into 4 sections, each one occupied by one of the 4 Allied powers: the Soviet Union, the U.S., Great Britain, and France. The Soviets reacted to the merging of the western zones of Germany by announcing a blockade of Western Berlin, saying we are just going to cut off West Berlin, from all resources and supplies. They closed all highways and railroad links to the city from the west. The Western Allies refused to abandon Western Berlin, and they began massive airlifts to feed and supply the city. The United States was heavily involved in this. Within a year, Stalin had capitulated, given up, and the Berlin Blockade was lifted. The Soviets then turned their occupation zone in Germany into an independent nation, which becomes the German Democratic Republic, also known as East Germany. So you can see here the airlifts, very important to the survival of West Berliners. So, two problematic examples of the further spread of communism that arise in 1949, which deepened the Cold War, the first of which was the fall of China to communism in 1949, with the rise of the communist leader Mao Zedong, who retained totalitarian rule over the Chinese for quite some time. And then you have the Korean War, which ran from 1950 to 1953. A few years prior to this, the Korean Peninsula had been divided at the 38th parallel. Okay, you can see that here. And to the north, you had the communist governments, the capital there, Pyongyang, and you have to the south the Democratic Republic of South Korea. This war would unfortunately end in a armistice signed in 1953. It left Korea divided at the 38th parallel, exactly as it had been before the North Korean invasion 3 years earlier. American losses had not driven the communists out of China or North Korea, but had further shown American determination to resist the spread of communism by force. Neither side was able to defeat the other. Korea remains, as you know, divided this day. So the further evidence of the spread of communism with the fall of China to communism and the Korean War led to what became a second Red Scare in America, this anti-communist hysteria. Here you can see Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, who began the House Un-American Activities Committee, otherwise known as HUAC. And he basically began a witch hunt for suspected communists in America. So those who came under suspicion could not work for the government, couldn't find jobs in private industry. This especially affected Hollywood actors. McCarthy became popular and helped other Republican candidates to Congress win their elections. Important families like the Kennedys gave him financial support. President Eisenhower, however, disapproved of McCarthy, but failed to criticize him openly. McCarthy would fall from favor, but nevertheless, the Red Scare, this anti-communist hysteria in America, was very real. So we're going to end with a few final thoughts on the deepening of the Cold War. A couple of events happened leading into the late 1950s, early 1960s. At the top here, we have the rise of Fidel Castro in Cuba. And in 1961, we have the Bay of Pigs invasion. Because, of course, the United States was not happy to see a communist dictator come to power in Cuba. And in April of 1961, about 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles attempted their invasion of Cuba by landing at the Bay of Pigs, which is right about there. Okay? So, the night before the attack, CIA planes bombed Cuban airfields, but failed to destroy all Cuban aircrafts. Basically, Castro and his men, as you can see here, were ready for them. Castro had surrounded himself with protection, and although the operation had been planned while Eisenhower was president, President Kennedy took the blame for its failure. Many thought the CIA was also at fault. That leads us into 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we'll talk more in detail about. This was a tense 13 days in October of 1962. when we came to the realization that the USSR had been supplying Cuba with missiles, and being 90 miles away from us, this was quite concerning to us. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is often seen as President Kennedy's greatest foreign policy success. We were able to establish this embargo line where the USSR ships were not allowed to pass, bringing more missiles into Cuba, and he was able to negotiate with USSR President at the time, Khrushchev, and they began negotiations for a partial test ban treaty, which they signed the following year, which banned all testing of nuclear weapons except underground. So this was seen as a great success for President Kennedy. And finally, we have the construction of the Berlin Wall in the early 1960s, which you can see starts out as quite generic, just a small wall, but it would become, by the end, this massive wall separating East and West Berlin, as you can see here. Okay, so that wall would not come down until 1989. So there you have just a couple of the key events of the Cold War. Join us next time, and we'll be talking about the 1950s.